And go.
All right, awesome. Well, welcome everyone to today's deliberate discussion. I am super excited for today's discussion. We're going to be presenting some national information on the state of racial home ownership, as well as some programming information from the National Fair Housing Alliance. Today, we are joined by Nate Johnson, who is going to be moderating us today. Let me tell you a little bit about Nate. Nate is the president of Real Estate Solutions, a full-service commercial and residential real estate brokerage with a commitment to helping clients achieve their real estate goals. Nate serves as an agent development role for Red Key Realty Leaders, Nate, which is the largest independent real estate brokerage in St. Louis. In addition to representing buyers and sellers in real estate transactions, Nate manages a sales staff while overseeing the daily operations of Real Estate Solutions. Nate is the 2021 chairman of the Sustainability Advisory Group for the National Association of REALTORS and served as the 2018 president of the Missouri Association of REALTORS and the 2011 president of the St. Louis Association of REALTORS. Whew. President bound. Nate currently serves as president of the board of directors of the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing Opportunity Council, which is the only nonprofit fair housing enforcement agency working to end illegal housing discrimination in St. Louis. Nate speaks to groups all over the country about fair housing, diversity and inclusion, as well as smart growth and sustainability. Nate instructs a variety of courses related to these topics and more, including the Code of Ethics, Business Development, and Leadership. Nate has a passion for helping people achieve their real estate goals. He believes that education is the best way to ensure that they are prepared to make good real estate decisions. So welcome, Nate. We're so happy to have you. I'm going to let you take it away and introduce our panelists and our video. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janet. And I'll tell you, it's a real honor to be here this evening with you. I say this evening, I'm in St. Louis, so it's 6:30 my time. And I'll tell you, I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to have with these dynamic professionals. So let me just jump right in and introduce Brandy Snowden. She is the Director of Member and Consumer Survey Research for the National Association of REALTORS, and is part of the Survey Research and Communications Group. She assists with the production and dissemination of survey research reports, as well as focusing on digital and social media maintenance and content creation. She also serves as a liaison between internal research department staff and non-members and consumers. Brandy has a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in sociology from St. Mary's College of Maryland. So let's give Brandy a round of applause. Welcome, Brandy. Wow. And our next panelist is Laurie Benner. She is the Associate Vice President of Programs for the National Fair Housing Alliance, and she's responsible for developing, implementing, managing, and evaluating innovative national programs designed to advance research, programs, and policies that provide equitable access to home ownership, housing, economic, and other opportunities. Prior to joining NAFA, Laurie served as the Director of Housing Programs for Maryland REALTORS, the state association. Laurie holds a bachelor's in legal studies, a master's in nonprofit and association management, and an MBA. So we thought that we would kick off. Let's give Laurie a round of applause. Yes, welcome. So we thought that we would kick off this afternoon's discussion with a video. So Laurie, you've got something to share with us.
I do. I will go ahead and share this video, which is integral to some of the programs I described later and really sets up some of the remarks that both Brandy and I will be sharing with you.
How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. As a black person in America, I just need the key. What key? Home ownership. Unlocking the doors of opportunity and wealth for myself and my community. 7 out of 10 white Americans own a home. while only 4 out of 10 Black Americans own a home. The average white American's net worth is $171,000, but for Black Americans, it's only $17,000. Do the math, that's 10 times more wealth. This gap in our country is a tragic disappointment. Something is wrong with our American dream. After 246 years of enslaving Africans, followed by 154 years of systematic oppression, are we surprised with these results? Just like any other American, I want to own a home, leaving a legacy for my family and community. But is the game fixed and not in my favor? Let's look to the past for answers. Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me stories of being stolen from their homes in Africa and sold as property. Stories of the American Constitution declaring that all are created equal, while simultaneously claiming enslaved Africans were only 3/5 human. They were called property. Tell me, how can property own a home? Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me how they were emancipated from slavery and exiled into 100 years of segregation and discrimination. Stories about Jim Crow laws forcing them into separate bathrooms, schools, restaurants, and neighborhoods. I hear of 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where bigots, steeped in white supremacist ideals, burned down Black Wall Street, destroying their thriving businesses and homes. They were called exiles. Tell me, how can exiles own a home? Sitting at the feet of my ancestors, they tell me how they were quarantined like a disease after the Great Depression. The Federal Housing Administration drew red lines around their communities, marking them as undesirable. They share painful memories of banks denying them credit and then being sold crooked contracts by predatory lenders. And in 1926, the Supreme Court allowed white Americans to ban them from purchasing homes on their street. They were called a disease. Tell me, how can a disease own a home? Property, exiles, disease. If that's how our ancestors were seen, how could they win? The game was fixed, but from the ashes they rose as people, not property, as citizens, not exiles, as healing, not a disease. Harriet Tubman knew she wasn't property, freeing the enslaved from physical and mental bondage on the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass knew he wasn't an exile, declaring that to have a home, one must have a country. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. knew he wasn't a disease, preaching healing and then losing his life in a fight for civil rights, economic equality, and fair housing. The week after his assassination, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, making it illegal to keep Black Americans, like my grandparents, from owning homes. Tubman, Douglass, King. They started this battle for true liberty and justice for all. Today, we're standing on their shoulders, boldly fighting to defend policies like the Community Reinvestment Act and Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform. Laws that are helping close the devastating wealth gap created by America's transgressions of slavery, Jim Crow, and redlining. So as a Black person in America, grabbing the keys to home ownership, I open the doors of opportunity and wealth for myself and my family. My hope is realizing an America that collectively acknowledges the wrongs done in our past and boldly roots out inequality in our present, that forever invests in Black lives and communities. A solid foundation has been established, but much is left to build. Our generation, empowered by honest lenders and protected by federal laws, can create wealth and close the gap. Because America is our country. This is our home, and it is our time to rise.
Into a daybreak miraculously clear, I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, naturally, there I go rising.
Wow. Wow. Well, that was a very powerful video. Thank you, Laurie, so much for sharing that with us. And, you know, it's a great way to sort of kick off the discussion for this afternoon, because, you know, when we're dealing with the rate of home ownership among diverse communities, we know that it's different. And the question becomes, why is it different? And what are the things that we need to do to level the playing field to create a truly equitable community? So the National Association of Realtors recently produced a report on race in the home buying process in America. Brandy, I'd love it if you could share some of the highlights from that report with us.
Sure, thank you, Nate. I'd be happy to share some of those highlights. I'll just share my screen really quickly. Is everyone still able to see them if I just make them big? Sorry, I didn't know that my notes would go away if I did full screen. But just wanted to give a little overview of this report. This is the second year that we've released this report, and I work on this with one of my colleagues, Nadia Evangelou. And this year's report is made up of 3 sections, which Nadia worked on the first section that looks at home ownership and affordability trends by race and state over the past 10 years, and using American Community Survey data for that. And I worked on the second 2 sections of the report that I'll be focusing on tonight, which feature homebuyer demographics and fair housing data from our Profile of Homebuyers and Sellers report, some of that data. And also, this is the first year that we added in questions on fair housing. So I'm excited that we were able to include those in this report. And first, looking at household composition, we see that among Asian Pacific Islander home buyers, they made up the largest share of married couples at 70%, whereas we see that single female home buyers were most common among Black and African American home buyers at 31%. And also looking at some other demographics, we see that 52% of Pacific and Asian Islander and 50% of Hispanic and Latino home buyers were first-time home buyers. And also looking at income earners and within the household, the majority of all buyers had a two-income household with but we see that the highest share of households with only one income were among our Black and African American home buyers. And that Hispanic and Latino home buyers were the most likely to report having 3 or more income earners at 8%. And also looking at multi-generational home buying, which is something that we're seeing really picking up. We see that 23% of Asian Pacific Islander home buyers and 18% of Hispanic and Latino home buyers purchased multi-generational homes. And among those groups, they primarily purchased a multi-generational home in order to spend more time with aging parents for healthcare and caretaking of aging parents or relatives, and also wanting a larger home that multiple incomes could afford, and also for the cost savings. And this is compared to the share of Black and African American home buyers who purchased multi-generational homes, which was at 15% and only 10% among white buyers. And we're also seeing that the role that family plays and helps family can provide with help entering home ownership. And looking at down payment sources, 15% of Asian Pacific Islander, 9% of Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and white home buyers used a gift from a relative or friend towards their down payment for their home. And we also saw that these home buyers could be using a loan from a friend or a relative towards their down payment. And also another way that family is helping Our recent home buyers may be that they were living at home prior to purchasing, with 17% of Hispanic Latino home buyers, 16% of Asian Pacific Islander home buyers, and 15% of Black and African American home buyers, saying that they lived with parents, relatives, or friends prior to purchasing their home. And that's compared to only 10% of white home buyers. And next, looking at education, we see that Black and African American and also Asian and Pacific Islander home buyers had the highest share of buyers with at least some college education. But once we look at student loan debt, we see that Black households are more than twice as likely than white households to have student loan debt. And Black households typically had a student loan debt amount of $40,000 compared to $30,000 for white households. And we also saw that the largest student loan debt amount was among Asian Pacific Islander home buyers at $42,600, while they reported the lowest share of having student loan debt. And then looking at whether our recent home buyers were denied by, had a mortgage application denied, 10% of Black and African American home buyers and 6% of both Hispanic, Latino, and Asian Pacific Islander buyers reported having a mortgage application denied, compared with just 4% of white Caucasian buyers. And the main reason for Black African American, Asian Pacific Islander, and also white and Caucasian home buyers for being rejected was due to their debt to income ratio, while the main reason for Hispanic and Latino buyers was due to low credit score. And in addition to being asked about their recent home buying experience, recent home buyers were also asked if they had experienced or witnessed discrimination during their real estate transaction. And also when asked about their neighborhood and if the majority of the residents were the same race as them, 64% of Asian and Pacific Islander, 63% of Black and African American, and 55% of Hispanic and Latino home buyers said that the majority of their neighborhood was not the same race as them. And then also looking at ways that recent home buyers witnessed or experienced discrimination in real estate, in a real estate transaction. The most common discrimination was steering towards or away from specific neighborhoods, with 34% for both Hispanic and Latino, and white and Caucasian home buyers saying that they experienced this, while Black and African American and Asian Pacific Islander home buyers were more likely to report witnessing or experiencing discrimination with more strict requirements for themselves, also the type of loan product that was offered, and also purchase offers being denied for possibly discriminatory reasons. And then also when our recent home buyers were asked whether they had experienced discrimination in a real estate transaction, 7% of Black and African American, 5% of Asian Pacific Islander, and 1% of Hispanic and Latino home buyers reported experiencing discrimination based on race. 3% of Black and African American and 2% of Asian Pacific Islander home buyers experienced discrimination based on color. And while the majority of home buyers said that they did not experience discrimination during their transaction, a large percentage still say that they believe it exists. And looking at whether discrimination was reported to a government agency, 9% of Black and African American and 1% of white and Caucasian home buyers reported the discrimination to a government agency. And these are just a couple of the highlights from a very interesting report. And especially if you're interested in the first section of the report on home ownership rates, the full report is posted on nar.realtor under the research tab. And also, I believe it is posted in the chat if you're able to see that. Thank you, and I'll send it back to Nate.
Thanks, Brandy. Thanks for sharing that report with us. I'll tell you, there were some interesting things in there, that I saw when we look at the where people were getting their down payments for their homes, I thought that was pretty interesting to see that African-American population, 17%, just 17% used proceeds from a previous sale, from sale of a previous home, in comparison to 37% of white home buyers. And when you look at where funds were used for down payment, you saw 15% of African Americans' funds came from, or 15% of African Americans drew funds down from their 401ks or other types of loan. And that's in contrast to 5% of white home buyers. And, so what that really, what that speaks to me about is how the wealth creation has just not been there for African Americans as well as other minorities that you showed in your slide. And I think that it's important for people to recognize and understand that just because the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, that doesn't all of a sudden mean that all of the housing discrimination that has occurred before then and after then doesn't still have an impact. Those numbers that you share with us shows that there's still a huge impact that's occurring in minority communities as it relates to creating equity and equality and wealth building opportunities through home ownership. So can you speak to the sort of the gap in home ownership rates that occur in different areas in different states? Is there one? What does that kind of look like?
There definitely is. In the first section of the report, my colleague has gone into that, but just looking at this section of data that I had just talked about, we see that a lot of minorities are being priced out of home ownership, and it's due to rising home prices and also the lack of inventory that we've been seeing. They also have more student debt and, of course, lower household income. So they're finding it really challenging just to enter home ownership.
Yeah, it is definitely a challenge. So here in St. Louis, I'm a practicing realtor on the streets, helping buyers and sellers achieve their real estate goals every day, in addition to, instructing courses. And I was instructing a course today at the At Home with Diversity course. And one of the conversations that we had just dealt with the inventory shortage that many of our communities are facing all over the country. And one of the things that I brought up is, and your report really speaks to that, because I talked about how, many of our clients are losing opportunities to people who have cash offers that they're able to make. And we're not talking about investment types of property. We're talking about first-time home buyer types of property or second-time home buyers. And what we see is that because of the current environment that we're in, African Americans and other minorities are left behind because they don't have the access to that cash that their white counterparts have. And often that cash from their white counterparts is coming from equity that was built in home ownership with their parents, who are able to loan them the money to buy the house cash so that they can then refinance it. So this is a real issue, and we all have to work together to figure out some solutions to overcome some of these challenges, because the gap in home ownership rate is going to continue to widen, because currently there's just fewer homes on the market, so there's a lot more competition. And if we don't figure out a way to resolve that, we're going to further lose ground as it relates to creating equality among diverse groups as it relates to home ownership. So are you finding that specific initiatives and policies in certain states are helping some of the underserved communities? What's being done to address some of these issues?
I can't necessarily speak to state specific programs, but I know NAR has developed a couple of initiatives, including At Home with Diversity, and also Fairhaven, the new ACT program. And there have been also those challenges that have been promoted, especially among our committee members. We've been really encouraging that, but I think it really helps with that. It would really help that our members are more become more familiar and more aware of everything, that is definitely a place to start.
Got it. Got it. Fantastic. I noticed in that report as well that it talked about discrimination. And I thought it was kind of interesting that just 7% of African Americans and 5% of Asian Pacific Islanders said that they experienced discrimination. And my question is, how do they know? Because when we look at, for example, the Newsday report that we're all familiar with out of New York, out of Long Island from 2 years ago, spoke of the fact that nearly 50% of African Americans were shown homes in different neighborhoods than their white counterparts. And if you're not from that market, you don't know that you're not being shown homes that other people are being shown. So when we look at discrimination, so if I went to the Long Island market and experienced discrimination, I may not have even known that because I'm not familiar with that market. So in answer to that question, I would have said, no, they showed me some houses, I bought one. So is there anything more that kind of goes into that? How do we sort of really understand the reality of discrimination? Because I think that we can all agree that it's probably being experienced a lot more than people even realize that it's being experienced.
Right, and that's true because especially in our survey, these are all successful home buyers. So even if they were denied a mortgage application or that they had reported facing discrimination, they have all gone on to successfully purchase a home. So I definitely agree that there's, they might not have always known what was happening, or if they did, they might not know how to report it. So yeah, it's definitely awareness again. Also, I guess if you're working with a realtor and they, you bring it up to them, that they know where you can go to report that kind of discrimination.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So did the research find anything about communities of color as it relates to their experience with homeownership challenges due to the pandemic? Is there any data on that NAR has put together?
In the full national report, we do look at pre and post pandemic home buying. Unfortunately, we don't have that data in this report, but we are also releasing a really interesting, for home buyers, no, we don't have that, that information available now, but since this is the first year that we have added those questions, I think we'll be able to tailor them better based on the responses that we saw this year, and hopefully we'll have even more data to report next year.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brandy. Thanks for that information. That's all extremely helpful for all of us, certainly. So let me shift gears and talk to Laurie for a second. Laurie, so the National Fair Housing Alliance has a number of interesting homeownership programs. Can you talk about what some of those programs do and kind of enlighten us a bit on the work that the National Fair Housing Alliance does?
Sure, absolutely. It's hard to compete with the impact of the video we watched earlier and Brandy's great statistics. But I thought it was important to share, given the topic of our conversation today. It's foundational to some of the programs that I'll be sharing. I should also add that any opinions I voice today are my own and not necessarily those of my employer. I've been told on multiple occasions or complimented or maybe even backhanded compliment how candid I can be. So I want to make sure I put that out there. But the National Fair Housing Alliance is a 33-year-old nonprofit civil rights organization. And the reason I say civil rights as opposed to fair housing is that although it's been clear for decades, we need to keep reaffirming that social justice, economic justice, racial equity, housing opportunity, environmental factors, wealth, education, health, digital access, access to credit, and on are all intrinsically linked. So while the heart of the organization is fair housing, our mission really goes beyond just the four walls of a home. We are a membership organization and serve as a trade association for fair housing centers across the country. In fact, one of the items we're focusing on right now in our strategic planning is deepening the relationship between fair housing organizations and real estate professionals by offering expanded benefits and services. So NAPA focuses on investigation and enforcement, education, outreach, and community development, programs and partnerships, public policy and advocacy, and litigation. So you might be familiar with some of the big bank litigation on their maintenance or lack thereof of REO properties in communities of color, the Facebook fair housing case, and sometimes real estate organizations like our lawsuit against Redfin. And the reason I mention real estate organization is not to imply that we're hostile towards real estate companies, but it's clear that partnership and education need to be a focus. I kind of liken it to the relationship between real estate agents and housing counseling agencies. My years at Maryland Realtors showed me that there's a disconnect between the two, and sometimes we see that with between realtors and fair housing centers as well. But because we're here to talk about initiatives and programs designed to positively impact racial housing disparities, I'll share a few things that NAFA is working on. First is our Tech Equity Initiative, which focuses on bias in artificial intelligence, or AI, primarily in lending. And its 5 main goals are to develop solutions for removing bias from technologies, to increase transparency and explainability for AI tools, to help advance research to help reduce bias in tech, to develop policies that promote more effective oversight for AI tools, and to support efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tech field. So this is a brand new team led by Dr. Michael Akinwumi, and he's really just started to source and evaluate data. So we're excited to see how that work will progress. And the ultimate goal is to create some open source tools designed to de-bias AI. Another effort that we are ramping up now that we have a more, shall we say, cooperative administration, federal administration, is the promotion of special purpose credit programs. Now, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA, provides a powerful tool for targeting lending programs that benefit economically disadvantaged groups who share common characteristics such as race, national origin, or sex. It seems pretty straightforward, but programs like these have been and probably will continue to be challenged. If any of you followed the outrage that occurred when Coldwell Banker announced their inclusive ownership program last year, you know what I mean. The minute you start talking about racially explicit programs, some people get mad. And NAFA engaged with a civil rights firm, a law firm in DC, to explore the statutory and constitutional framework behind special purpose credit programs to demonstrate that protected class conscious programs are compatible with anti-discrimination laws. So we have a blog and a blog post and a white paper on that topic that I'll be happy to share both within the Deliberately Fair Housing Facebook group, and I could also probably drop it in the chat. But there are a number of national nonprofits, government agencies, and other housing-related groups engaged in conversations about how to create and operate these programs, particularly in light of President Biden's executive order on advancing racial equity. So the last program that I will share about is the one that I was hired at NAFA to spearhead, and it's called Keys Unlock Dreams. I'll share a few slides on that. You can bear with me for just a moment here. Okay, can you see that okay, Nate?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Keys Unlock Dreams really is centered around homeownership, and particularly homeownership in Black and Brown communities. So the Urban Institute is one of our big research partners, and we have a number of initiative partners, corporate partners, and we're in the process of rounding those out and inviting more partners and looking for additional sources of partnership. So you'll find me on a couple of these slides violating the cardinal rule of sharing PowerPoints. And I'll be reading off of these slides for anyone who's in listen-only mode or anyone who may have some visual impairments. So our 10 key cities that we're starting off with are Columbus, Detroit, Memphis, Atlanta, Baltimore, Houston, New Orleans, Oakland, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. And these communities were chosen based on demographics, homeownership gap, and places that NAFA has existing strong partnerships. There are about 5 other cities that we've been approached and are considering, and we're willing to undertake additional cities, pending additional funding, of course. So when we talk about launching in these cities here, what we mean by that is conducting specific research in each of the cities through our partnership with Urban Institute, and that'll be evaluating demographics, the homeownership gap. We'll be looking at each community's community health needs assessments, as well as analysis of impediments to fair housing reports, and determining how those should be looked at or integrated better. And in each of these cities, we'll be having an industry event, which will kind of look like your typical one-day housing symposium where you bring together industry partners and players, have some panel discussions, some legislative discussions and the like. And then we'll also be having a consumer-facing event designed to provide information and tools and resources to prospective home buyers to kind of help them move along their path towards homeownership. So the 5 initiative goals for Keys Unlock Dreams are to remove structural barriers that perpetuate racial inequity, expand affordable and fair housing options, prevent an unbalanced recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, empower consumers and stakeholders with critical information and resources, and that kind of goes to the consumer events that we talked about, and help close the racial, wealth, and homeownership gaps. Now we hope to meet these goals through some components, and that is the research that I talked about in partnership with Urban Institute and other community partners, advocacy and public policy. The more conversations we have with partners and the more this research bears out, will probably help inform some national level public policy and advocacy efforts. Products and programs, that is centered around some of the, also some of the research that we're doing and some of the homeownership resources that we're going to develop. Education and outreach, again, that's a lot of the consumer-centric and consumer-focused efforts. And then partnership is really a big key here. Because we are a national organization that's doing this effort in specific selected cities, we can't be everywhere and know all of the things all of the time. So we really rely on our partners in those areas. And those partners may be corporate partners. They may be community nonprofits, housing nonprofits, fair housing action centers, housing counseling agencies, and of course, realtor associations. So I've started doing the work of reaching out to a lot of the associations in our key cities, to start talking to them about the work that we're doing. So we will have a full court press, social media outreach in each of the cities, and then on a national level. And again, to the point of partnership, we're working with a number of organizations to help amplify and lift up their priorities. So there's a group called the Black Homeownership Collaborative, and they have a goal of 3 million net new Black homeowners by 2030. We're working with NAREB, on their brand new initiative that's getting ready to launch. And that is for 2 million new Black homeowners in the next 5 years. And then working with NAHREP on their goal of 50% rate of Latino homeownership by 2024. So again, partnership is really the name of the game in the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative. So those are kind of just, we always have lots of stuff going on, but those are some of the biggies that kind of are most pertinent to our discussion today.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Laurie. You guys have a lot of work that NAFA is doing. I'll tell you, one of the things that struck me was that you're working to reduce bias in tech and AI, so I take that to mean like facial recognition. We've seen reports where, facial recognition has a disproportionate adverse impact in the minority community because of its poor job that it does at recognizing accurately faces. So that seems interesting that NAFA is working on that initiative, because it just seems it seems like such a bigger thing. So, beyond the scope of my understanding of what your organization does. So how did you guys get involved in that space? And do you have partners and others that are kind of helping you, take a bite out of this elephant?
Sure. So yeah, I saw your eyes light up when I started talking about this, and I said, I know he's going to ask me some questions about this, and I hope that I can answer them. So it really comes down to fair lending, is what it does. It's with the algorithms. It's from what I've heard it described that really, a computer can really parse through the almost infinite amounts of data that's out there on individual people, and it can tell what race you are, quicker than you can just go look somebody up and find out for yourself. So the way the data is used algorithmically is pretty stunning. And so we want to work to de-bias that and to make it a more fair, to have more fair outcomes for particularly for buyers of color. So it really started with the fair lending lens. And our team, it's kind of brand new, so they've really just started on this. So access to data is really what it's all about for them. So they're working, with the big lenders, with government entities to try to get our hands on the data in order for them to kind of do their thing and evaluate it.
Got it. Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And you mentioned Coldwell Banker program and, working to provide opportunities in underserved communities. And you also mentioned that there were a couple of other things that you're working on. NAFA's preparing a white paper on some of these types of programs and how they could be used. It makes me think of the recent announcement from Evanston, Illinois, with the reparations. And I wonder, because it seems like that is starting more of a conversation about what can be done to maybe undo some of the some of the adverse things that have happened in minority communities as it relates to home ownership and wealth creation opportunities. So can you talk just a little bit more about that program and maybe a couple of other programs and kind of what that looks like?
Sure. So I think that the best example to kind of hold up is the special purpose credit programs. Unfortunately, we all know that race got us to where we are today in terms of the wealth gap and the homeownership gap. Explicitly, race was used. But now you really can't or have to be very, very cautious with trying to use race to correct the problems, because the Fair Housing Act and a number of other things were put into place to prevent the discrimination. Now it's kind of flipped to on the other side, where it's very difficult to use those programs, such as special purpose credit programs, which is really like a lending program that you target to a specific population. So in other words, creating a lending programs and saying, this program can only be used by Black people. You know, that's controversial, and a lot of people would push back on that. There would be, and there, like I said, there have been challenges on that. So using the framework of ECOA to create these special purpose credit programs is just one of the tools that we're looking to use and to really expand in order to help with these things. You know, there's a number of things that people way smarter than I am are using to try to use as proxies for race in developing these programs, such as first generation home buyers. So as we know, a lot of Black people were denied opportunities for many, many years. And so their grandparents, parents may not have been homeowners because they were denied opportunities. So now if you are a first generation home buyer, for example, then you may be able to use these programs. So we're not saying that it's only for Black individuals, but we're saying kind of statistically who is more likely to fall into this category. It's more likely to be buyers of color than others. And also the same with immigrant populations. You know, a lot of the times their parents were not homeowners either. So it's that type of thing that we're trying to use race to undo some of the damage that's been done.
Got it. It's interesting, Laurie, because clearly race was the defining characteristic that prevented home ownership opportunities for dozens of years in our country. And now there seems to be an opportunity to use race as a way to perhaps correct some of these injustices that have occurred, but there's pushback on that. And, you know, that's unfortunate, because I think that what we really need to be doing is looking at how do we solve the problem that was created. There was a precise problem that was created using precise mechanisms. So it only stands to reason that we use a precise mechanism to cure those problems. And that's just me talking. So.
No, I mean, but we hear it all the time, you know, when I referenced the Coldwell banker, it's, you know, people get mad about that. Well, you know, why can't we, you know, because the understanding tends to not be there with the history. And it's, oh, that was, you know, 50 years ago, you know, that's not an issue anymore. But people don't understand that these generational problems that they endure, and that it's still a problem today. I mean, the laws may have been shored up to a certain degree, but the problems really do prevail.
Indeed they do. So Laurie, you come from our realtor community, you know, as a former staffer of Maryland Realtors. So can you talk with us about the importance of realtors engaging in fair housing efforts?
Oh, yeah. So, you know, and that's one of the things that, you know, it's not really in my job description per se, but I've really been trying to help bridge that gap, you know, to make that connection between the fair housing organizations and the realtors. You know, I think learning about the history is an important first step, and we've seen more and more of that in the past few years. But I was at NAR's mid-year conference in DC in 2018 when we were commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And I recall vividly hearing a collective gasp that went up in the room when a slide was presented showing the pre-1950 Realtors Code of Ethics. And I'm going to read it here because I don't have it memorized, but it says, "A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood." And the room was just, they were shocked by that because of the lack of knowledge of the history. So we know that realtors in the real estate industry were complicit in perpetuating discrimination of that time, whose impacts can still be felt today. And we've seen public apologies, you know, from Chicago Association and later by NAR. I think the next step is to empathize with those impacts and further educate on implicit bias and fair housing. Brandy mentioned those in her remarks. I thought the Fair Haven training was excellent, for example. Realtors should develop relationships with housing counseling agencies, fair housing centers, and make sure they're informed about lending programs. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, so I'll take it one step further and say that the onus is on realtor associations to push for change. Half of the states in the US have no fair housing continuing education requirements for real estate agents. And if it's voluntary, the people who need the information the most, they won't show up. So also existing education needs to be improved. One of the biggest complaints I heard from realtor members was that the classes were rote and largely a recitation of dates and protected classes, and they failed to include or expand on practical guidance. The last thing I'll mention is the need for realtors to hold their colleagues accountable and support clients in making official complaints. Be knowledgeable about the reporting process and the organizations responsible for those. And realtors need to know that they can be parties to fair housing complaints because discriminatory actions impact their livelihoods.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. We all agree with you that realtor associations need to be more involved in mandating more fair housing education and lobbying their licensing authorities within the states to mandate that, because it's one thing for the association to say that there's a requirement, but it's a completely different thing for it to be mandated by the state licensing body, which really has the teeth and it can really create that requirement and mandate. Because it's a challenge. I completely agree with you. I talk with realtors all over the country about fair housing, and every single program I deliver, the majority of the people in the room are shocked by the things that I'm saying about how we got here in our communities all over the country. And what's more shocking to a lot of people is that there's a sense that this was something that just happened in the South. And that's obviously not the case. It was more prevalent, in the North in many ways. When we look at what happened in Chicago, we saw the recent the Duke study, the Duke University study. It said that something near 80% of all Chicago homes that were sold to African Americans in the 50s and 60s were on contract for deed. Resulting in $3 to $4 billion of wealth loss, just over, that just in Chicago alone, based on the inflated prices that they were selling these homes for. Because as we know, there's any time an African American or another minority had an opportunity to invest in home ownership, they would take it because they didn't have any other alternatives. When you look at the urban slums that were created, people were looking to escape that. And by any means necessary, if that meant getting a contract for deed that had terrible terms, even those terrible terms, were more bearable than the impoverished conditions that they were living in, just simply because of the color of their skin. And only to have, these additional clauses and additional bills come up that were sort of tripping folks up so that those real estate brokers in many cases and other blockbusters were able to take those properties back and then resell them to other African Americans and repeat the cycle. So Brandy, some of the data that we were kind of looking at here, it shows these significant disparities, and realtors more and more discussing and learning the history about how this has occurred and sort of where we're at in today's market and how we got here. So I asked Laurie about what she felt that we as realtors can do to make a difference. What are your thoughts on what we as realtors can do to have a positive impact?
I will say also similar to what Laurie said, that really holding each other accountable and also challenging each other to learn about the history and also being just accountable for their actions and to help any of their clients if they are experiencing discrimination. I think that those are what members should be doing.
Yeah, so there was a great comment here that I just happened to see from Janet. If people are okay inheriting wealth, they have to be okay with inheriting how that wealth was gained and repairing the damage to those victimized by government programs specifically created to victimize groups and BIPOC and the very people who were victimized funded the benefits through the payment of taxes. That's what we see. That's what we know was occurring, and in many ways still continues to occur. So that's something that we have to address. So we've got a question from Denise Wilson, and she asks, so what can be done to reduce the cost of student loan debt so that more Blacks have a better ratio to buy and less debt and won't have to use their 401k. So let me restate that. So what can be done to reduce the cost of student loan debt so that more Blacks have a better ratio to buy and less debt and won't have to use their 401k?
It's definitely a good question, very loaded question. Not sure if I have the exact right answer, but Laurie wants to chime in on
Well,
this.
I was going to say that is really something that goes far beyond Brandy or I, or really, anybody on this call. That's something that has to happen really at the highest levels of government. There's a lot of discussion right now about student loan forgiveness, a lot of controversy surrounding student loan forgiveness. But there's a whole lot of issues wrapped up in that. The pushing of student loan debt, the fact that, and I think it's improved from when I went to school, but when you go take out a mortgage loan or a car loan, you know exactly what you're looking at. This is how much you're going to pay per month. This is your interest rate. It's all made very, very clear to you, so you know exactly what to expect and for how long. It doesn't work that way with student loan debt. You take out, an amount of money, but it's all kind of conceptual. There's nothing really saying this is what your payment is going to look like once you graduate. And then the next year, tacking on the next amount. This is what your payment's going to look like now. So you don't really have, a clear concept of what your obligation is going to be after you graduate. But really, the cost of education, the programs contemplating free community college, a lot of those things are really like big government, federal interventions that need to take place. There's not, I don't personally see a lot programmatically that we can do to move the needle on that.
Got it. I'll tell you, so the National Association of REALTORS has done some things that I'm extremely proud of over the last few years, with bringing on Brian Green to head up the Fair Housing Policy Group. And of course, he's been promoted to Vice President of Policy now. But, some of the work that he's done and that has sort of led up to him coming on board has been great. You mentioned the Fair Haven program and the ACT and a lot of the other initiatives that have sort of, the overriding bias video that came out, a lot of work that's been done. And our current NAR president, Charlie Oppler, is not put the baton down. He's continuing to further fair housing during his term with a challenge. So that's in the chat. You'll see that he's got some resources and he's got a challenge out there, a fair housing challenge that everyone that all realtors can take advantage of. And I would encourage you to do so, as our president, Charlie Oppler, has. So what else, do you see, Brandy, on the horizon as it relates to NAR initiatives? What are things that we may not be talking about right now that we should be talking about that our National Association of Realtors has for us?
I can talk from the research perspective about the work that we're doing. I did see another question about whether we'll continue this research, and we definitely will. And also another question about some of the categories that we had chosen. So we'll continue to expand those and tailor those as needed. And yes, we expect to have another snapshot report this next year. And also another thing that we have coming out next week is looking at membership, our membership, and also why they choose to enter the career of real estate, and also looking at minorities, and also looking at LGBTQ members. So that report is the Choosing a Career in Real Estate, which I would also recommend, that will be released next week and has a lot of great information.
Got it. Fantastic. Thank you. So can either of you speak to maybe what the federal government's doing around fair housing? I know that there's some, President Biden has some things cooking, so to speak.
I will say that we're in an interesting place right now with federal efforts because the Trump administration essentially completely gutted many of the mechanisms in place, including the duty of municipalities to affirmatively further fair housing. Jurisdictions that receive housing and community development federal funds were required to perform an analysis of impediments to fair housing every 5 years. That requirement was scrapped, and we fully anticipate it to be reinstated. Also, as I mentioned before, the Biden administration has made racial equity a centerpiece of its platform. So I do think we can expect to see additional efforts. The Black Homeownership Collaborative that I mentioned earlier is almost finished with a 7-point plan, which aims to provide framework for housing opportunity. And this plan addresses disparate impact, affirmatively furthering fair housing, strengthening enforcement at HUD, down payment assistance, housing counseling, expanding the Community Reinvestment Act, and a great deal of regulatory efforts. So I think the time is right for a lot of these efforts, to start to bear out.
Got it. Fantastic. So Catherine White has a question, and she's curious if someone can talk about the investment versus owner occupancy ratios, particularly in minority communities. Is there a way to encourage correction of some of that imbalance, as it has some broad impact, in her opinion?
And particularly in our studies, we only look at owner occupied data. So I'm not sure if I would be able to speak to that.
Got it.
So that is part of the research that we're doing in our Keys Unlocked Dreams cities. However, that it's just now, getting underway. So I can't really, comment in any substantive way, but it's definitely something that we are looking at in those cities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you. Kendra Kim is asking about student loan debt. So do you think that federal government canceling student loan debt would help increase home buying? And also, do you find that are your associations lobbying for the cancellation of student loan debt? What's the position on that, so to speak?
I'll jump in here. I don't know if we're doing any specifically lobbying in that area, but do I think that canceling student loan debt will help increase home buying? Absolutely. I absolutely do think so. Some of my peers have, you know, they have monthly student loan payments that are as much or more as a mortgage payment. And especially if you're talking about a couple together, you know, paying $3,000+ per month on their student loan debt. So I do think it will have an impact. And I do think looking at some of the repayment plans and restructuring could be beneficial. Anecdotally, I'd heard about a couple who got married, and because their combined income increased, both of their student loan payments increased to an amount that was just, you know, unbearable. And this couple actually looked into getting divorced because of that, because their student loan payments were just skyrocketed. So I do think so. And I did this peek in the chat that our friend Cher Powers said she'd love to see a deferment of student loan debt with no increase in interest for first-time buyers for the first 2 years of home ownership. And I think that that's a really interesting concept because so many first-time buyers, you know, walk into the house, you know, cash poor. So having that deferment would help them, you know, build up reserves and be able to potentially better handle an emergency or to be better prepared to sustainably maintain their home ownership.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Laurie. So, Laurie, the you know, the nonprofit advocacy world and realtors can sometimes be in a silo, even when we're working on similar goals like reducing barriers to home ownership, you know, for underserved communities, as well as addressing affordability issues. What ideas do you have on how we can strengthen the relationship between realtors and others that are working to address these home ownership barriers and disparities?
Well, you really said the key word right there, and that is relationship. So forming relationships with fair housing centers, with community development organizations, with housing nonprofits, with housing counseling agencies. You know, develop a relationship, make yourself present, you know, attend their events or their education, offer yourself as a resource. And you're right, and that goes both ways. So I know that our audience right here is largely realtors, but I would say the same thing in speaking to any of these organizations, that they should endeavor to make relationships with realtors, realtor associations, you know, brokerages, because that information sharing is absolutely critical. When I was at Maryland Realtors, a big part of my position there had to do with outreach and partnerships with the various housing organizations. And just that information sharing is absolutely key. They still reach out to me, as do a lot of the realtors that I worked with, you know, to make those connections and to have those discussions and to information share. So I think really the relationship building is where it's at. And I mean, that's right in realtors, you know, wheelhouse. That's what you guys are good at. Networking, forming relationships. So just extending it one step beyond looking for, you know, potential clients, because the information that you learn through those relationships will ultimately benefit your clients.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Tamika says, make implicit bias training mandatory, ! Yes, indeed. Indeed.
Yes,
We all.
Tamika is one of those realtors that I just talked about that used to work with, and she and I, you know, share stories all the time. So you know, hearing what's happening on the ground is so key in pushing efforts forward. But yeah, she's right. Make the bias, you know, the training mandatory, increase the fair housing related education. All of those things is where it's at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Got it. So, you know, Brandy, in the research that you do, what is what's the most shocking thing or exciting thing that you've discovered or that you've learned through the research? Is like, wow, I didn't expect this. Share with us what that research has looked like and kind of what are some of the aha moments that maybe you uncovered in the work that you do.
So looking at this report, for our national profile of home buyers and sellers report, we had enough data to pull out 2 chapters on home buyers and home sellers pre-pandemic and also during. One of those charts did make it into the snapshot of race and home buying report, and just looking at the percentage of home buyers who purchased pre-March 2020 and also purchased April and later, we still see that the share of minority home buyers slightly increased, or in one case stayed the same. So we're still seeing that these home buyers are still wanting to purchase homes and in most cases, in a lot of cases, enter home ownership. So doesn't seem like the pandemic has been deterring people from wanting to start that journey.
Got it. Interesting. So by the way, if anybody in the audience has questions, please, feel free. We've got some time. We've got some pros here. So if you've got questions, they would love to answer them for sure. So don't be shy. So Laurie, what do you think is the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge in our industry when you think about housing, what is the biggest challenge that we have to face?
That's a big question. The biggest challenge. Wow. Well, I mean, centering it in the whole purpose of this discussion. I mean, obviously there's some huge challenges out there market-wise in terms of, inventory and all of those kinds of things. But framed within what we're talking about today, I think it's back to that knowledge and education. We're speaking to a friendly group here, but I have realized through my time, my background is, nonprofit, community development, neighborhood revitalization. And so for much of my career, I was around kind of like-minded people. So when I reached the Realtor Association, I realized how broad and diverse our members were in terms of, social leanings, in terms of political leanings. So I think that part of it is meeting people where they are. So like I said, we're in a friendly group here. We're kind of, somewhat on the same page about what we're talking about. But there's a large number who don't know the history, don't understand the history, don't necessarily appreciate the history, and need to be informed. At Maryland Realtors, I was in charge of our DEI efforts, and a lot of those efforts that I see across the country focus on the D, the diversity, and the I, the inclusion, and they leave out the equity piece. And that's something that needs to be leaned into a little bit more, as well as meeting people where they are in terms of their understanding. There's a whole lot of people out there who are not necessarily willfully unaware, but if I'm going to be real about it, white people tend not to really have to think about race, very much at all. I was just having a conversation with a friend of mine, like, I don't worry about getting pulled over by the police. I don't worry what that outcome might be. So, a lot of white people moving through their world and their lives, they don't think about race. So now that there's this kind of awakening for a lot of people, you have to realize that it's not always intentional, it's not malicious, it just comes from lack of knowledge. And so you kind of have to take a step back and explain some of these things, explain For example, for, LGBTQ issues, explain pronouns, explain sensitivity, explain how some of these racial inequities and the homeownership gap and the wealth gap, how that came to be. So really, covering from the very basic 101 all the way to the advanced, topics of this, I think really are key.
Yes, that's a lot. Thank you, Laurie. That's a lot. Those are a lot of challenges, and baked into those challenges are opportunities, certainly. And I think that you sort of shared some of those opportunities that we've got with the current administration and their focus on creating more opportunities for people of color. So hopefully we can see that come to fruition and really work to move the needle in a positive direction as it relates to creating more racial equity and fair housing opportunities. So Brandy, on the research side of things, what are you up to now? What's next on your agenda, or what do you, or are you at liberty to share that information with us?
I think most of the reports that we're working on now are ones that we've done in the past. So I think it's fine to share. My boss Jessica is on, so she'll tell me if it's not. So the big one upcoming, of course, is the member profile. Also, I mentioned the choosing a career in real estate report. We'll also be redoing our profile of home staging, report on sustainability, and also a report on marijuana. So those are some of the upcoming reports.
Got it. Fantastic. Well, let's see here. So let's see here. So panelists, considering, I've got a question from Tamika, considering all of the institutionalized racism that has been deeply entrenched, lending processing, appraisal, shabby home inspections, etc., in the homeownership, home buying opportunities for Black, Indigenous, people of color, what do you believe will be a true resolution for the homeownership gap? We're here to solve problems this evening. Let's do this.
Tamika is out here with these questions. She and I send messages back and forth all the time, just, putting us on the spot. It really, in my mind, a lot of it has to be public policy and legislative. As much as we strive to educate our fellow housing industry professionals, you can't really just make them take a class and not be racist anymore. We hope, that may be a little bit of a crude way to put it. But some of these things have to be excuse me, legislated.
Well, so Laurie, you mentioned policy, public policy being a critical component to that. I certainly agree that public policy is important, but, you mentioned that under the last administration, the mandate to affirmatively further fair housing was rolled back. But what we know is that mandate was within the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and it didn't happen. So it didn't happen until President Obama, it didn't seem to start to happen until President Obama said, hey, this is supposed to have been happening. How about we focus on this and start to say, hey, maybe we will withhold funds from communities that are not living up to that mandate of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the public policy is there. We can go back to 1866 and look at the Civil Rights Act during that time, which said that, all citizens, all people will have the same rights to buy and sell, inherit, lease, hold real property as is enjoyed by white citizens. So then we had the policy in 1866 to sort of create equal opportunities for everyone. But it was the mindset that didn't mirror the policy, because it still is people, it's up to people to implement the policy and adhere to it. And as we know, throughout history, when people want to discriminate, they find a way to do it. They find a way to do it, whether it's in other types of legislation, whether it's through restrictive covenants, and things like that, whether it's, it's through poll taxes and when we're talking about voting, all these things. I mean, we can go on and on and on, of course, all these reasons. But to me, when we think about policy, yeah, the policy is great, but how do we change the hearts and minds of people? Because I know that you said it, you said rather crudely, we can't just educate somebody and expect them to not be racist tomorrow. But the reality is we kind of have to do that. Because if you're still racist, you're not going to implement the policy no matter what. You're going to find a way around it. You're going to find a way not to implement it. So how do we change the hearts and minds?
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it has to be, you have to hit it from all angles. I'm actually encouraged to a certain degree, and maybe it's just the young people that I know and see around me in my world. But I do see a shift among the young people. So I'm hoping it's one of these things where, generationally it makes a difference, where, as some of those young people rise up into positions of authority in government, that, they will help turn the tide. And, you're right, the public policy and the legislative, a lot of the framework has been there. But I think it's been a challenge to, quite frankly, get white people to substantively change a system that's treated them so favorably. So, it's getting everybody, locking arms and working together on these things. And I don't know how we change the hearts and the minds of people, because I live in a community. My zip code had the highest number of hate bias reports in the entire state of Maryland in the year 2018. There was some horrible things that happened, at my daughter's high school. So I honestly, I don't know how you change those deeply ingrained attitudes and values that some people still continue to hold.
Yeah, I think you said it. Frederick Douglass said it. He said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." So when you talk about folks that have privilege willing to, quote, give that up, they're not willing to do that. As they're just not willing to do that. And I think that the understanding has to be created that this is not a zero-sum game. That a rising tide lifts all boats. We can all be successful. We can all have opportunities, and we'll create more wealth and more opportunity, not taking one opportunity from one person and giving it to another person. I think that that's the short-sighted approach that unfortunately so many people see, and so many people have sort of rode down the, sort of taken that privilege, and instead of using the privilege effectively to create different positive outcomes within the communities that they live and work in, and that they see around them, what we've seen, unfortunately, is that people have a tendency to hoard that privilege and to continue to feel that if I share this privilege and create more opportunities, I won't have the opportunities, which is not what we want to see. And you mentioned the younger generation and hopefulness there. I'll tell you, I am hopeful there as well. But I'll share this quick story with you. My daughter, 13-year-old, I have two girls, 11 and 13. My 13-year-old comes home and she tells us that someone at her school called her the N-word. right? And, you know, I was immediately furious. I was like, give me the phone number. We're calling the parents and we're going to handle this right now. And of course, you know, my wife, cooler heads prevailed. And we did make that phone call and we did go over there. We, you know, they were, you know, they were besides themselves about what happened. So we went over, we had dinner to talk about this. And one of the things that my wife said to the boy who called this to my daughter, what she said was, you know, you've got an opportunity here. You've got an opportunity to take your privilege, take your affluence, take your white maleness, and you can just live a golden life as a result of that. Or you can make the tougher choice to use that privilege to create different outcomes for people, you know, to use it effectively, use that privilege effectively. And my hope when I think about the future is that that young man took that in and is going to think about that and think about how he's going to behave and how he's going to use his affluence and privilege, because he can use it for good or he can use it just to continue the status quo, which is hopefully not the road that he will take. And I think that it's up to all of us to work to have more of those conversations with people so that they understand that this privilege does exist, so that they can make a choice, make an informed choice about what they want to do with that privilege and opportunity. Because as you said earlier, I think that so many people are shocked, you know, that there is this, that there are these challenges that have existed and that this racism persists and that discrimination is still prevalent in our communities. We have to make it front and center and make sure that everyone understands that they have a choice, because then, you know, then we kind of know where everyone is. You know, as Dr. King said, you know, evil prevails when good men and women do nothing, right? And I think that that's the hope that I have, is that good men and women aren't aware of these issues, so they're doing nothing. But once we make them aware of these issues, hopefully we'll have more people stepping up and being part of the solution as a result. So as we're wrapping up, you know, for the evening, Brandy, Laurie, anything that you'd like to share with us to sort of close us out for today?
No, just I know that we covered a lot of topics. So if anyone has any questions that you think of later, I think that they had put my contact information in the chat. So feel free to reach out with any other questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brandy. Laurie?
My parting remark or encouragement would be to report incidents of fair housing discrimination, support your clients, you know, learn what to do to make those reports, learn where to go, learn where your community partners are, report. And if you and or your clients, for whatever reason, don't want to and aren't comfortable with it, at the very least, have a conversation with your local Fair Housing Action Center, or you can call me, email me, let me know. I'm compiling a long spreadsheet of terrible, you know, fair housing things that have come to light just in the last couple of weeks. And it helps organizations that do enforcement and investigation target those resources, so we know where problems are, and can divert resources to do investigation and to do enforcement work. So that's really what I want to encourage all of my realtor friends to do, is to report incidents that happen.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, Brandy Snowden, thank you so much for joining us. Laurie Benner, I mean, this has been an amazing conversation, and I really appreciate Deliberately Fair Housing creating the forum for us to have this conversation with everyone. So let's all do our part to further fair housing in our communities. So Janet.
Thank you so much, Nate. I'm not. Okay, awesome. So I really appreciate you did such a wonderful job for us, Nate, moderating this discussion. Laurie, Brandy, thank you so much for your awesome input and your knowledge. really helping us understand where we are with this issue, and then programs, of course, that will help us actually further fair housing across the board. So I appreciate that. I want to make sure that people are aware that we are going to have a book club again for the month of April. April is Fair Housing Month. We are looking at April 22nd, and we will be posting more information about this on Deliberately Fair Housing. The book that we are going to be reading is Levittown. Now, Levittown actually has a very long name, the book itself, so I won't go into the exact name, but please look for that. We'll be advertising for that as well. The discussion, I promise you, will be an awesome discussion about Levittown and the development of that whole area. So please join us for that. We believe that's going to be on April 22nd. And until then, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We will see you all soon.